On our journey through the centuries, I'm reminding you that we didn't invent urban or cross-cultural ministry in our generation. We come in at the 21st floor of more than 2,000 years of heroic work in cities. And I'm part of that legacy. I'm in touch with that. I'm reminded of John Fry, an amazing colleague in Chicago who had the guns of the Blackstone Rangers stored in the safe in his church. He was negotiating peace between gangs. He wrote a book called Fire in Blackstone. He was being investigated by Congress when they found out he had guns stored in his church safe. He used to come around McCormick Seminary where I was studying and teaching some church history. He used to say things that got everybody's attention. One day, a young Presbyterian said to John Fry, who was a former Marine, Princeton grad, and everybody's hero for what he was doing on the streets of Chicago. And they said, "John, what does it take to be a good urban minister?" And he said, "Unless you can read Hebrew without the vowel points and exegete any passage in the New Testament Greek inside 15 minutes, you have no business in the ministry." And all the Presbyterians hit the floor in shock. He said, "I want to tell you, if you can't tell me where the church has been, you have no business telling me where it ought to go." I never forgot that. The deeper you go out on the bubble of contemporary risk, the deeper that taproot must be in Bible and history. To neglect any century is to deny the Holy Spirit's ministry in the church, in my view. And so I have an affectionate relationship with those people who've gone on before. I wish there were time to walk you through the tough times of the 13th and 14th centuries. At one point, a third of Europe died in 3 years. Barbara Tuchman describes it in her book, Distant Mirror. And at that time, the churches were ministering. It was a brutal time. The 100 Years' War, so cold the Baltic froze over 3 years in a row. But I want to say it was also a time when the gospel was almost getting lost. Like most historians today, I view the Reformation and Renaissance not as an abrupt thing, but as the harvest of things happening in the late Middle Ages, Luther included. What I want to do is talk about models of reform. The reformers were not all working the same way. And I want to introduce several models of reform. And for me, they're important because I don't believe there is any one way to reform a city or society, much less the church in the city. Savonarola of Florence had the idea that you could reform the church if you did evangelism. That is, if you preach the gospel, one person at a time multiplied by the masses, you will reform the church and society. He didn't get to live long to test his theory. He was burned at the stake in his city in Florence. But since Savonarola to Billy Graham, there have always been people who said evangelism is the way you do it. And we all know people who say that today. Erasmus of Rotterdam, scholar, said education is how you bring about renewal. He said, we have pastors who've never seen a Bible. And so he produced a Greek text and he said, we've got to get back to the fountain, back to the knowledge. And you know there are people in our day who say exactly the same thing, that the church will never rise higher than the pulpit. And so like Erasmus, they are saying knowledge will bring about behavioral change and reform. And we have many seminaries who believe that and want everybody to know the 3 languages of the cross and see that coming from the clergy. And so the scholarly clergy is the model. It's pure Erasmus. And so from the Reformation to the present, we've had that as a model. We had another group of people at the time of the Reformation we call conciliarists. That is, they called councils. They were the Peter Druckers of the 16th century. They believed in having better management in the church. You see, there was too much depravity concentrated up at the top. Their idea was, let's spread it out a bit. Even had more than one pope. We had all these corruption at the top. Now, Père d'Ailly, Henry of Langenstein, Jean Garçon, these were some of the people. And I love their writings. They were serious. They would have gone to McCormick Seminary and taken middle judicatory management theory. They would have written PERT charts. Their name is legion today. People who say, if we just had better goals, better objectives, and outcome-based ministry, we would be better off, and we'd bring about reform and renewal. And we all know that we're surrounded by people who say that today. There was a fourth group at the time of the Reformation that said, the church is incapable of reforming without government assistance. So Henry VIII in Parliament said, let Parliament reform the church. Government assistance model, 1534 Supremacy Act. So the Parliament created the English church. The king saw to it. In Spain, another version of that was let the Inquisition do it. That was Jimenez's idea. Now, have any of you ever heard somebody say, we need to elect more conservative judges? We need prayer in public schools. Any of you hear things like this? The government needs to help the church do these things. The government-assisted model has been around a long time. It's an old model. And there were people at the time of the Reformation who said that. There are other people, fifth model, there were other people then who said, you know what, you can't reform the church, let's start new churches. Some of them were called Anabaptists. They said the whole church is corrupt, let's get back to a more biblical model of church. Now we've got church planter models coming out today. It's the new buzzword. Say, let's give up on all this mainline Christianity and all the existing established churches so corrupted, so compromised, it can't really be a New Testament church. Let's get back to grassroots and back to relational Christianity, back into the house church or something like that, cell church. Again, which is it? A little later, of course, Ignatius Loyola, after 1540, said, let mission reform the church. We're all incestuous here in Europe, climbing all over each other. And so he formed the Jesuits, and they became the shock troops of the papacy to take the gospel far away. Don't you hear people once in a while saying, mission will bring about renewal in our church. We have to get back to be missional. Now, I've just mentioned 6 ways to reform the church. All were done in the Reformation. By the way, what did Luther do? Well, all of them, didn't he? I mean, trick question, okay? Luther and Calvin used them all. They didn't get very far down the missional path because they were in the first generation of reform within the church there in Germany and Strasbourg and Geneva. But the truth is, when you analyze Luther and Calvin, part of the effectiveness was the comprehensiveness and inclusiveness of more than one model. When I look at the cities today and the complexity of the cities, I know it's going to take all the models. It's going to take all of those ways. It's going to take evangelism. Let's not deny it. From Savonarola to today, we need evangelists. We need Erasmus, big time. There's a knowledge world out there. There's a knowledge explosion. It's an informational age. We need Erasmus to help us work with post-Christian reality. We also need the conciliarists, new structures. Cities are complex environments. We need people to help us think about that, obviously to help us fund that. We need things other than just 19th century denominations to package the ministry. We do need government assistance. I don't deny that. People on the far left and the far right have gone around the barn and joined hands on that. They all recognize, left and right, that we need the government to help us, a partner. And we've been invited to the table in some governments and not others. But I admit that. We also need to recognize that new churches, as well as the renewal of old ones, is necessary. And I admit, mission is another one of those. Now, all of these are models from the 16th century, so that when we study those models, we can see those paradigms at work in our own city. Those are photographs of very great importance for me. We come now to the industrial Europe. I have many, many photographs. Obviously, can't share them all. In 1759, 3 guys were born that became friends for life. Wilberforce, Pitt the Younger, and Charles Simeon of Cambridge. I've studied their lives. They were interesting people. They met for 50 years together, along with Hannah More and John Venn and others, in the so-called Clapham group, to work on the slave trade. This was an amazing group. Wilberforce, they worked on slavery. John Howard came along and worked on prison reform. These were people who not only cared about their parish, but Charles Simeon, who pastored the poor, who taught at Cambridge, who wrote commentaries, who was 5 times dean of the chapel at King's College, Cambridge. Charles Simeon, who appointed chaplains to prison ships that went off with prisoners to Australia. He, every month, went down to Clapham and met with his friends to work on the slave issue. One of the reasons we had a civil war in this country over slavery was we didn't have a group like that working on this issue for 50 years. It took them till 1807 to get a bill through Parliament to ban slavery in the UK. It took them till 1837, the year after Simeon had died, to get a bill through Parliament to ban slavery in the entire British Empire. This handful of evangelicals who combined the pulpit with the Parliament, 2 sides of the public ministry coin, pulpit and Parliament, they brought it together and they affected public policy and they saved England from a civil war. And I'm in agreement with scholars who have written about those saints in politics, that we need to call out of our churches people who will, from Esther into the modern time, work in those public sectors, where pulpit and Parliament need to come together again to affect policy. One of my heroes is Lord Shaftesbury, 1801 to 1885. Shaftesbury was one extraordinary layman. He had a mental problem. He ran a low-grade depression most of his life. His biographers say he could hardly function sometimes. But for 10 years, he worked on the 10 hours bill to limit labor to 10 hours a day. For 10 years, it took him to get the Parliament to pass a law to widen the mine shafts of England. They were 18 inches wide, which meant only children could mine coal. And this Anglican evangelical got them to widen the shafts. They resisted for years. They said, it's too expensive. We'll never compete with German coal. You ever hear that kind of argument? Then when the children came out of the mines, there were no schools for them. What we call public schools in America, the common school, the publicly funded school, was invented by him and colleagues. It was called the Ragged School Movement. It was to teach people in ragged clothing how to read. The first public school was the product of this layman who knew that children would someday stand before God. They should at least be able to read the King James Version, which is their indictment. And so the Bible became the text for the ragged schools. It pains me to see Christians abandon public schools. We created them when nobody else cared about the ragged children. He invented a sewer system. He took a verse from 1 Corinthians and invented the London Water Board and drained swamps and invented sewers. I would not have put Corinthians together with a sewer system, but he did. In fact, that sewer system was exported to Calcutta. The Hooghly River runs through Shaftesbury sewers to this day. People bathe on the streets of Bombay, which is now called Mumbai, and the British, whenever they went, they took Shaftesbury sewers. An amazing life. He gave himself for the city. He transformed it. He went to prison, as Jesus said we should do, to preach, Matthew 25. He was shocked to discover mentally ill people were routinely put in prisons. He came out and formed founded the first mental health hospital in the history of the world. This layman changed the world as much, said Georgina Battiscombe in her biography, as Jesus had done. These are wonderful photographs. September 21, 1889, Jane and Julia walked down the street of Chicago. They bought a house and they moved in. Jane moved into the second floor. She was a rich kid. Her father had died and left her money. She went to Rockford Women's Seminary and she majored in Greek. She decided to move into the middle of a Greek slum, where she was shocked to discover that the Greeks there didn't know Greek classics at all. She thought her Greek from seminary would make her perfectly fit to work in the Greek community. Jane moved in. 2 weeks after she got there, a burglar broke into her room while she was pretending to be asleep. She was scared to death. The burglar went through her belongings, rifled everything, put them into his bag. And as the burglar was about to leave, she cowered under her blanket, and she finally blurted out, "Why don't you use the stairs? You might get hurt." The burglar sat on her bed and started to cry and said, "I don't mean to rob people, but how do I support my family?" Jane Addams went out the next day and founded a garbage collection company to hire this man. That's how Hull House began. The social ministry that began in Chicago in the Greek ghetto. Jane Addams organized the first Greek theater in the inner city of Chicago's Greek ghetto to teach Greek to Greeks, because they had been so oppressed by Turks over many decades that they had forgotten their classics. That was urban ministry by Jane Addams. I wish there were time to take you through the stories of Foster in his book, Errand of Mercy, the story of the Evangelical United Front, his dissertation done at North Carolina. From 1790 all the way through the 1837, the Plan of Union, the American Bible Society, the slum ministries, all kinds of things were started. The Finneys, the Tappan brothers, these people came together and they worked in the city of New York, and they spread out through cities all over the world. Sam Mills, an example, the Haystack Movement, all during that period. I wish there were time to take you through Timothy Smith's Revivalism and Social Reform, 1830 to 1860, what Christians were doing in the slums of America. Or Norris Magnuson's dissertation reprinted called Salvation in the Slums from 1860 on. Evangelicals, people, our churches, ethnic American evangelical churches invented or reinvented urban ministry in this culture. And then those churches went up market and to the suburbs and forgot that their DNA was urban in the first place. I wish there were time to talk to you about what I see happen in Salvation in the Slums, social gospel movement, evangelism, the rescue movement started in Glasgow, 1826. Naismith had this idea of rescue missions. Started in Glasgow and came to New York and Chicago and spread all over the world. 1864, the Salvation Army, organized as an army to deal with the masses of the poor in England. 1890, 2 books were written that you have to read in tandem. They're absolutely wonderful for urban ministry. The first one was written by Stanley of Livingston fame, called In Darkest Africa, The Way In. 6 months later, an irate William Booth wrote, In Darkest England, The Way Out. And it was his response, how dare you do an end run around the cities of Europe to go into the jungles of Africa? What is this white man's burden you're talking about? And he was challenging the church to come back to the cities. You have to read these 2 books side by side. The Salvation Army, fortunately, has reprinted Booth. In Darkest Africa, The Way In is the traditional missionary, let's go to Africa and save the lost. In Darkest England, The Way Out is basically his response to the city. I wish there were time that we could read these and talk about them together. I wish there were time for me to take you to Mother Teresa. I slept with my wife under the mosquito netting in her place. I had a bucket. My wife had a bucket to bathe in. I've heard her say, and many of you probably have too, heard her or on camera or read what she said, I don't love the poor. I don't even know them. But I see the face of Jesus in the poor. So when I serve them, it's an act of worship. Is that a wonderful motive? It's not about us doing good for them. For Teresa of Calcutta, it's worship. It's worship. Well, 2,000 years since Christ and Paul, the church has been following the contours of an ever-increasing urban world. And there is a photo album out there. And I've just shared a few of my favorite photographs. There are many, many more. Of people who, through the centuries, loved cities, loved Christ, loved the risk, took the risk. And those are, for me, the encouragement that I need, along with Scripture and the Spirit, to keep going. And I hope that what I've shared with you encourages you. Remember, we didn't invent urban ministry. I hear people talk as though we did. We didn't. We were perilously close to forgetting some things in our respective denominational traditions. And I hope that I have reminded you, as well as me, that humbly we come back and redig those wells and re-explore the implications of our traditions in the cities. God has put us on this planet at this time with 6 billion people. He's collecting these people into world-class cities, 400 or more of 1 million or more people. He's put us to be stewards of the kingdom's agenda in those places. Programs we can invent, we can read about. What I'm talking now is a theological worldview. It's a perspective. It's rooted in Scripture and anchored in some historical reality, and in suggesting that we have the tools to exegete the modern city and apply principles in this context to seek the transformation of the city. Perfection is not possible. Progress is. To God be the glory, to the earth be peace, to the believers be courage, to our cities be hope. Thank you, and God bless you.